So I'm reading from Acts 18, chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. In Corinth. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, most of our passages have been super long because it's all narrative style, and you kind of have to lump in a lot. And originally I was going to go much longer in this text, but I decided I kind of last minute changed things up, and I decided I wanted to go in a different direction. So this might be kind of like a part one to a part two next week. But next week we'll talk about something different, but I'm still probably going to use these same 4 verses, but I'm going to get at a different idea. But I thought that this was maybe a good place to talk about the idea of, and I know that the faith and work kind of thing, if you've been around certain Christian circles, especially in New York, it's kind of like a trendy, or at least it was at one point, to talk about faith and work, right? Integrating our faith with our work. And I don't want to over-spiritualize work. So it's not that work in itself is this grandiose thing that bears with it all this spiritual fruit. It's not that. It's more of, how do we think about our work, just actually participating in work, getting our hands dirty, and whatever type of job we have, whether that's computer or manual labor, or what that might be, as a way to be ministering to other people, or how in those settings we can be ministering to folks around us. But the other thing is interesting, I think, about this specific text is that within the context of a city that I think is incredibly familiar, and as we'll see, to New York City, to our larger context. So 2,000 years removed, right, Corinth, first century, to New York City today, I think that there's a lot of similarities in how Paul would have stepped into that world and to what we might see. And so that's kind of what I want to look at, is these 2 kind of broad concepts. So the familiar world of Corinth, familiar as in familiar to our world here, and then Paul's ministry in that world. And so kind of the first point I'm kind of going to focus on kind of talking about Corinth, the city, and things like that. I'm kind of going to nerd out a little bit on some like urban versus rural distinctions and things like that, but follow me with it. And then we'll kind of just look at what Paul does in that world. So first, a few things about Corinth. You go, okay, you can all see that. And let me first kind of note that thus far, if you've kind of been tracking with us in Acts, Paul's journey has pretty much started in Palestine, right? And he's worked his way on his missionary through Asia Minor. He eventually got up to, you can see Philippi up there, which I preached on weeks ago, that he kind of cut through Asia. He goes up to Philippi, and he hits some of these bigger cities up there in Greece, Macedonia, and then he comes down to Athens. Michael preached on that part of the text last week, which was the previous chapter. So, he's chilling in Athens, and he's kind of sparring it up with the Epicureans and the Stoics, and he's having all those philosophical conversations and challenging their idolatry. And then he now comes down to Corinth. And what's interesting, and one commentator notes, and I'm actually blanking on his name right now, but whoever that commentator is, you get credit for this, but kind of notes that Luke, the writer of Acts, what he's showing, the progression or the change, is that it goes from rural. I mean, Palestine had cities and towns and things like that, but for the most part, Jesus' ministry is largely rural. He's kind of going in these tiny little towns. But what the change happens from rural to urban. Goes from the outskirts the outer parts of city where there's not much cultural influence into the really important cities. So for those people out there who, maybe not us because we're all living here in this city for a reason, but some of us might have kind of a negative view of the city, but we're just kind of here begrudgingly. There's a certain level of kind of disdain for cities, but Paul's going to those cities. He's going to the places where there's influence, where there's conversation, just as Michael preached about last week, where people are debating the philosophy of the day, where there's trade happening, and where the marketplace is a place of ideas, not just products. So he's entering into influential cities and towns. That's the progression that Luke is taking us on. So it actually increases. So Athens was influential, but then he gets to Corinth. Corinth was an incredibly influential city and unique in itself. It was a really wealthy port city because you can kind of see that it was, I'm actually going to change really quick. Okay. This on the left is like kind of just the larger picture. So Corinth is here. And on the right, that Diolkos basically is really fascinating, but it's an ancient, I think the Greeks tried to basically do a canal where they could move ships between the two. So you have the Aegean Sea on the one side and the Ionian Sea on the other side, and basically it would connect the east to the west. A faster way so ships didn't have to go all the way around. In other words, a faster way to make money, right? Faster way to increases your trade route. The canal didn't work, so the Romans, they colonized Corinth, and they took an old trick from the Egyptians in which they built pretty much a highway where they could roll the ships. Can you imagine that? They're rolling these ships from one side to the other. This is in first century, right? We think we're very advanced. They were pretty advanced. So they brought this advanced technology, the Romans did, to Athens, which they could increase their trade, increase their product. This also then created a very cosmopolitan city as a result. And actually, if you look at Corinth now, they actually did do a canal. So there's a modern day canal where cruise ships actually can pass through. It's really, really cool and really interesting. So let me back up here. So it really created a cosmopolitan city, cosmopolitan as in the world, right? Just because the trade route brought in migrants from all over, from the east to the west, back and forth. So Paul's landing in this city with the ultimate goal of eventually hitting the city of all cities, Rome, right? So the equivalent would be something like this at least in the American context. New York City is Rome. It is the city of the world, or at least for the West. But at the time, the world was the West. The world was the empire, even though we know that there were other big empires in the East. But for the West, it was Rome. So it would be something like, between Athens and Philippi and Corinth, it would be something like Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philly, Boston, right? These smaller towns that are close by, but they're incredibly influential. But they're not the empire hub, right? So this isn't Rome, and it's not a direct one-to-one. But what's interesting is that Paul spends about a year and a half, we're told, in this city, doing life. He picks up his trade. So the other aspects of it was ridden with pagan idolatry, similar to Athens. Like Paul talked about it in the previous, he confronts them. He's like, hey, I was just walking by and I just noticed that you have a lot of pagan gods. Like you have a lot of gods everywhere. So it's similar. And even though the Romans pretty much culturally kind of overtook Greek culture, it was Roman government. Everything was pretty much in Latin. There was still cultural influence, Greek cultural influence. There was, I think it was in the previous slide. It's in a coming slide. They still dedicated certain sites, the Romans did, to Greek gods. So there's still a paganism there. There's still an idolatry. like regardless of whether Rome had this control, okay? It was also known for its promiscuity. If you've read any bit of Corinthians, Paul talks a lot about sexual immorality. And it's not just Paul's writings that show this. And it's not just Luke that mentions it here. Because again, Luke's writing, we want to look at as a historical account, right? This is a historical account just as trustworthy as any other secular, non-religious accounts that are out there. But the non-religious secular accounts talk about how promiscuous it was as well. And part of this was just the trade. It brought in migrants. They would come for entertainment, right? It'd be like going to, you take your little stopover in Vegas, you get a little entertainment, whatever. It's kind of a similar thing. Or here in New York, at a time when it was even way worse, when Times Square was just ridden with sex clubs and strip clubs and pornography everywhere. It was a kind of similar concept. And it also kind of rivaled Athens in its philosophy, its idolatry as a marketplace. And so it created a competition where trade and market was increased in Corinth. And then it was also very pluralistic. Pluralistic in the sense of many different cultures, many different beliefs, many different religious views, and not one really common mainstream ordinance like you would find in Palestine, or you'd find in Jerusalem, where there was actually there was an established norm. There were established ways of living and morality. So it was pluralistic in that sense. And then it was also multi-class. They're pretty much the poor and the rich kind of lived next to each other. Sound familiar a little bit? Like, you go to, 96th Street on the east side, 97th Street is housing projects. 96th Street is, $5,000 apartments. So it's like there's a rich and poor were living right next to each other. There wasn't a large gap in class. Everyone was kind of just in the city structure. And cities, for the most part, kind of were like that. This wasn't just a uniquely Corinthian thing, but cities were just kind of like that. But this was one thing that was can be noted, at least, about Corinth. So kind of all of these things to consider. This was not just a nobody city. This is the world that Paul steps into. And I'm laboring this point because Paul spends 1.5 years here. He doesn't just make a quick trip through it, but he spends time in this city doing life, right? He picks up his trade and he gets at it. He gets his hands dirty. A few other sociological characteristics, I think, to mention, or definitions at least, that's kind of going to set up for some other things that I'm going to talk about. This is what I was going to show. On the right was the Temple of Apollo, which ironically, there's not really much left of ancient Corinth. Modern day Corinth is built off a few miles away. But basically, ancient Corinth is destroyed by an earthquake, and then it was kind of revamped in the 1800s. So I want to talk about a few of these ideas, because I think that these are common tides, if you will, in our city. They're common tides in our cultural narratives and within Western culturalism, but specifically in New York. So the first is the idea of pluralism. I kind of already touched on it. So as a pluralistic society, which basically means, right, not dominant norm, but it was religiously pluralistic. And this is what Leslie Newbegin, he's like a pretty prominent sociologist and missiologist and writer of like kind of our age. He says that differences between religions are not a matter of true or false, but different perceptions of that truth. To speak of religious belief as true or false is inadmissible. In other words, from a religiously pluralistic society, you can't say that your religion is more true than another religion. It's all based on perception. There's no way to actually prove it. There's no objective truth to say that this religion is right or that religion is wrong. Everything is relative and subject to individual interpretation. Does that make sense? There's not one dominant religion. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is this idea of, you might hear about this, but the individual expressed self. In other words, my truth is my truth. I form my identity. I am the ultimate decider of who I want to be, because all identity is socially constructed anyway. But at the end of the day, I'm the one that decides who I am. And to live to my highest potential is to fully live out myself, is to live out the expressed self. And that kind of goes into this idea of the high achievement and the high prestige that people in Corinth were going after. I'm not successful unless I'm the truest version of myself, and I ascend the social strata ladder, in other words. Like in New York, you'd say, you're a nobody unless you're something, right? That's kind of like an old New York saying, but like, in other words, you're a nobody unless you're truly living out your desires and your truth and what you perceive your truth to be. And it's part of this postmodern mood, in other words. Postmodern as in all truth is relative and socially constructed. You can't tell me that I'm right. I can't tell you that you're wrong. All truth is socially constructed, and that's that. There's no higher meaning above anything. Everything is arbitrary. Everything is random, and it just is what it is. There's no further meaning beyond that. So you live your truth, I'll live my truth. Happy-go-lucky, that sort of thing. But what I'm going to show is that, well, one, that's not realistic and doesn't ever work out. And I'll give you a little, maybe an appetizer, so to speak. And think about today. And this is a concept that I've gotten from a professor, or a realization of the way the cultural shift has gone. At one point, at least in the West, in America, but in the West in general, Christians were considered the ones that were moral. That was the moral tide, right? And it's flipped. Now, Christians or certain religious people are the ones that are seen as immoral unless you hold to a certain sex ethic or you believe in certain individualistic rights, so on and so forth. So it's shifted. Because now the individual expressed self is the highest standard. It's become the new objective truth, in other words. The individual expressed self is the new God. And so now today, there's a guy out there, Tim, New Evangelicals, and I'm calling him out here. And those in that world, and let me just preface, because I get where a lot of them are coming from. Them as those people that have deconstructed under a very dangerous fundamentalist version of Christianity. But this is what I want to challenge, that the notion that I don't like the God of the Bible because he challenges the way that I live, or because God has some ultimate form of justice in which he could send me to an eternal punishment, is completely dismissed. It's completely thrown out. In other words, I don't like that version of God, so therefore I'm going to throw that version of God out, and I'm going to create the own version of God that I want. So in other words, we end up creating gods that look like ourselves. We end up creating arbitrary gods that just look like what we want inside ultimately. So Tim, not Tim Keller, what is the type of God that we actually want? Is it the one that is unchanging in Scripture? The one that has a word that is unchanging and never comes back void? Is it the God that has an ultimate standard of justice? a God that can actually never be changed, so which we actually have to be the ones that conform to what he says is good and what he says is just about us, what he says is true about us. But see, it's the other way around. We believe that we get to be the ones to make that decision. We believe that we get to be the ones to say, no, I'm going to choose not to stand on the biblical truth found in Scripture, but I'm going to make that decision for myself. And I'm actually going to define God in the way that I want to define God. And at the end of the day, what we create is our own standards by which we judge God, which in effect is contradictory because we want to blame God for creating standards by which he judges us. But you see, we do the opposite. Even those of us who are Reformed Calvinists, right? We all have that tendency to do that. Because deep down inside, what we want is our expressed self to decide what is good in our life, to decide what is moral, to decide what is worth believing in and living our lives by. So to be a part of Corinth kind of brought this kind of mindset. It was a certain level of prestige. And there was you're right, it's like, there's a store on, I'm blanking on the street. Kay, maybe you know, or Glenn. It's called New York or Nowhere. Have you heard about this store? It's basically everything is designed as like New York or nowhere. Basically, the whole concept is like New York is the best place to be, and if you're not here, you're nowheres. In other words, it's a very New York way of saying it. The irony is a lot of people like to visit that store who don't live in New York and don't actually experience like what New York life is like and that sort of thing. But it's that same idea. It's that New York pride, right? You ask someone who's from New York and be like, hey, where are you from? Yeah, I'm from New York. Like, well, what part of New York are you from? What do you mean, what part of New York? I'm from New York. I'm from New York. There's only one New York. It's New York City, right? Like, there is no other New York. Sorry, Westchester. Sorry, upstate. Like, sorry, Long Island. You're not New York. Unless you're here, you're nowheres, right? It's that sense of pride. Okay, that's the same thing that we're seeing with people, that same kind of prestige and concept of cities, right? We're highly educated. We really have to make it hard here. McCollum, he's a writer, he notes that the urban Roman world regarded inhabitants of the countryside as clumsy, brutish, ignorant, and uncivilized, which Michael just moved to Katona. And the rural Roman world regarded those who lived in cities as baffling, extortionate, and arrogant. This is true, right? We know people on both of these sides that would say the same thing. And so there's a chasm between urban and rural. This is the type of person, the urbanite, that's the world that he's stepping into. Craig Keener, commentator, says, he notes that although a minority, urbanites, they did exert as well in the past, a broader cultural influence. That's the world that Paul steps into. Goes from rural nobodies to an influential society that has vast cultural movement across the rest of the empire. Anthony Thistleton, he's like a commentator, makes some really, really fascinating observations about Corinth. I'm going to try and summarize some of them for the sake of time, but he notes that the city community and the city culture felt themselves to be prosperous and self-sufficient, even if there were many have-nots who were socially vulnerable or dependent on others. New York City, say much. And he goes, the core community and core tradition of the city culture were those of trade, business, and entrepreneurial pragmatism in the pursuit of success, even if some paid a heavy price for business failures or the lack of the right contracts or the right opportunities. New York, right? In other words, the goal is this sense of higher self-achievement, even at the price of paying ridiculous amounts of money to live here or dealing with all the discomforts that we have to do to live here. He goes on to say the commercial and business prosperity of the city, as well as its competitiveness, pragmatism, and pluralism, brings us near to the heart of similarities with and differences from 21st century context of gospel proclamation. Another important feature of this, and this is this idea of social status and consistency. I'm going somewhere with this. He notes that most sociologists have come to see social stratisfaction as a multidimensional phenomenon. In other words, to describe the social level of an individual or a group, one must attempt to measure their rank along each of their relevant dimensions. Thus, power may be one such dimension: occupational prestige, income or wealth, education and knowledge, religious and moral purity, family and ethnic positions, and local community status. Provide other dimensions. These all provide other dimensions of variable status indicators. Sounds like New York City, right? Moreover, not all dimensions carry the same weight. The weight, and this is what he notes again, the weight of each dimension depends on the one who is doing the weighing. This feature dramatically characterizes the people of Corinth. He says, Meeks, this is another writer, concludes that this certainly applies to many of the Pauline circle, the people that Paul is going to minister to. We may venture the generalization that the most active and prominent members of Paul's circle, including himself, are people of high status and consistency. And then he goes on to say, this is Thistleton again, Corinthian culture has much in common with the social constructivism, competitive pragmatism, and radical pluralism, which characterizes so-called postmodernity as a popular mood, whether or not strictly chronological terms precede it, rather than follows Western modernity. In other words, what he's trying to say is a society 2,000 years ago, with its cultural constructs, the way it operated, its trade, the religious pluralism, all those types of things, is not so much different than what we might see today in our culture and within our context. He writes and goes on to say that in Paul's time, many in Corinth were already suffering from what he terms as a self-made person escapes humble origin syndrome. Let me just read that again, because it took me a few times when I first read it. Self-made person, so a self-made person, I'm trying to make it, is trying to escape humble origins. In other words, the whole goal is stratisfaction. It's to ascend to the highest version of yourself, whatever that expressed individualism is, or to climb the ladder of your job or your community or your educational ranks, whatever those things might be. That is kind of the ultimate goal. That's what people were defined as. And he also notes that in this kind of honor-shame culture, public recognition was often more important than facts. In such a culture, a person's sense of worth is based on recognition by others of one's accomplishments, hence self-promotion. It is self-promoting your public witness. That's going to happen at the Met Gala tomorrow night. It happens in most of our cultural settings, where there's the self-expression works in line with how culture perceives and values what that person's accomplishments are. And so this postmodern mood, we've been calling it, the familiarity between Corinth in the day and New York City now, this denial of objective truths, opting for self-recognition and self-expression, putting the self above everything else, relative truths, doing what you have to do to get to the top. That's what defines the world we're in. And yet into this world steps Paul with a message of foolishness to Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews, as he says in 1 Corinthians. And so this goes into the last point, briefer. Paul is extensively learned in Torah. He talks about it elsewhere. Would be higher status or of higher nobility amongst Jews. He was like the guy that had all the degrees, the 10 letters before his name, PhD, MD, whatever, like all those things, right? He had all the qualifications. He was like a top dog. And yet, what does he do? When he comes into the city, he meets a couple who first, they are coworkers in trade. He goes to trade. He goes to work. Some people think he was a tent maker. Other people retranslate and think he was a leather maker, or they used leather to make tents. Regardless of what it was, he succumbs himself to a lowly trades class, working with his hands. Society would have seen that as not noble. Doing trades work was blue collar. You weren't well respected in circles if you were doing that. He wouldn't have been well respected among the higher nobility of the age of those in Corinth. And yet he surrenders aspects of his rights to work. It's not because he's glorifying these positions. He does talk about in Corinthians as if it's a burden. He's not over spiritualizing the fact that he's doing trade work. But the fact that he was surrendering his rights as to not burden the Corinthian church, that was the whole purpose. That he would work to make his living so that he wouldn't burden the Corinthian church for the sake of the gospel. It was ministry in mind. And so when Paul finally in verse 5, we see the next verse, not part of our text, but Silas and Timothy come, they bring help from Macedonia, and he does eventually devote himself more exclusively to preaching of the word. But there's a time where he's involved in the day in and day out of life. The daily grind of life in the Corinthian city, where he's working with other people, he's in the mix of the city life. He's doing a somewhat low-class job, even though his nobility would possibly say otherwise. A writer, Witherington, he notes that Paul's self-humiliation, his assumption of a servant role, was directly at variance with the expected and accepted values of Corinthian city culture. In a city where social climbing was a major preoccupation, Paul's deliberate stepping down in an apparent status would have been seen as disturbing, disgusting, and even provocative. Paul participates in the everyday grind, daily life for the sake of the gospel. And so I think and I was going to read a chunk of 1 Corinthians, but I'm going to leave that for you guys. That will be part of the How Shall We Then Live section, is to go read 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and chapter 9, where Paul lays out his surrendering of his rights for the sake of the gospel, being willing to be seen as a fool, embracing the foolishness of God against the wisdom of the world, to live a life that is in line with the way of Christ, as he says. You see, Paul goes against the norm of self-expression. Some people would say today, or at least the tide would say, for you to deny your sexual desire, or for you to deny what you believe to be your identity, you're not actually living out your highest self. You're actually harming yourself, and you're harming other people, and you're immoral if you believe that other people shouldn't be doing that. It's liberalism to its fullest extent. And yet that's not the way that Paul lives this out. Because the way of Jesus, what did Jesus do? Well, he was a carpenter. He, as Glenn prayed earlier, the God of the universe comes down into our world. He gives up his rights, as Philippians says. He humbles himself to the point of death. He subjects himself to human cruelty. He gives up his rights in surrender. And Paul's saying, and Paul is living this out, that this is the truest and highest sense of self-fulfillment. This is what it means to be human. It's to deny our rights for the sake of others, for the sake of the gospel. And I think in all of our workplaces, all the time we spend with other people, we think at least 40 hours a week. If we're working a full-time job, at least 40 hours a week we're with people that are, if we're not, I mean, I think everyone else here is not working in a church, but are with non-believers. And so I think one of the questions to ask is, how are you spending those 40 hours in time after work or with your classmates? Are you so burdened by the gospel that it's impacting actually the way that you live? That you would be seen as oppressive or suppressing your truest sense of self, or seen as simplistic, or seen as immoral? Are you willing to go to the lengths, as Paul talks about in chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians, to be the scum of the earth, to be treated as the scum of the earth? Are we willing to go to those lengths for the sake of the gospel? So I think, in closing thoughts, I think those are the questions to ponder as we kind of go into Monday, as we go into Tuesday, and we go into the rest of our work week, which is, how are we living in a society like this? Are we being swept by the tide of cultural norms? Are we living what Paul says, to imitate him as he imitates Christ? And living a countercultural, missional life in the city, not assimilated to everything, but not isolated. So I think those are the questions to think about. And next week, there will be more to this to some degree, but I don't want to get too much into it. But think about those. So as over the next 2 minutes, we have like our time of silence, and then Glenn does his last song, or second to last song. Just ponder that. Think about what God might be, how he might be moving you as you're living life in this city. Let's pray.